So if you've seen the movie, The Count of Monte Cristo, or read the book, basically a story about a guy named Edmond Dantes, kind of a righteous, innocent guy. He's betrayed by his best friend, basically over a girl, and he is unjustly convicted of treason, and he is sentenced to Chateau d'If, which is kind of the French equivalent of Alcatraz, this island prison. And the rest of the story is about how he escapes from a prison and spends the rest of his life exacting revenge against this friend who betrayed him. But there is this scene in the movie where Edmond Dantes is ushered into his cell by the warden and by the rest of the jailers. I don't know if you've seen the movie or seen this scene or not, but as they walk into this stone room, the camera glances on the side of the wall, and there, chiseled into the stone, probably by someone's fingernail over time, is the phrase, "God will give me justice." The camera pans away from that, and we see Edmond Dantes in the middle of the cell. His arms are together, and it's being hoisted above his head by the jailers as they're strapping him up and almost lifting him off the ground. The warden is circling around him, and he begins his welcome to prison speech. And this is what he says. People are always trying to motivate themselves, or they keep calendars. But soon they lose interest and they die, and all I'm left with is a rather unsightly wall. So I've conceived another way to help our prisoners keep track of time. Every year on the anniversary of their imprisonment, we hurt them. Usually it's just a simple beating, but on their first day, in your case today, I like to do something rather special. So as he's continuing, he's unfurling this whip as Edmond Dantes is hoisted up, and he says, "And if you're thinking just now, why me, O God? The answer is, God has nothing to do with it. In fact, God is never seen in France this time of year." Edmond Dantes, our righteous hero, he says, "God has everything to do with it. He's everywhere. He sees everything." And the warden's response is very chilling. The warden says, "All right, let's make a bargain, shall we? You ask God for help, and I'll stop beating you the moment he shows up." And with that, the camera pans out and the whippings begin. So for the month of February, we're looking at these fears. Looking at the study that the University of Chapman did in California. Every year they do this research study. What are the things that Americans are most afraid of? It's a list of 79 fears, and they rank them in order. And we've noticed that there are 4 that kind of have bubbled up to the top that are expressed in different ways. And we're looking at these fears, and we're comparing them to the book of Psalms and how the Psalms help us, teach us, equip us to be not afraid, to fear not. Last week we looked at fear number 1, which was the fear of the government, the fear of government corruption or government abuse. And we saw how in Acts chapter 4, when the early church was confronted with a government that was abusing its power, they turned to the Psalms. They turned to Psalm 2 to keep them from fearing the government and to live victoriously. And so today we look at fear number 2. The second greatest thing that Americans fear, according to this study, is the fear of experiencing evil personally. The fear of someone personally doing you wrong or bringing harm into your life. It's expressed maybe as the fear of being a victim of a terrorist act, or being a victim of crime, or being a victim of identity theft, or just some way that evil touches you personally. This seems to be the second greatest fear of Americans. And so this idea of comparing our fear, leaning into the Psalms, is not really all that creative. Do you remember when Jesus was on the cross? So Jesus is on the cross, and one of the things he says on the cross as he cries out is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Y'all remember that? Somebody nod their head so I know you're awake. Okay, good. 2. We understand he's quoting the first verse of Psalm 22. And most of us understand that as Jesus was saying that, he was pointing his disciples to Psalm 22 because he fulfills a couple of verses of Psalm 22. So, for instance, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. The gospel writer John specifically says Jesus fulfilled this part of Psalm 22 there at the crucifixion. But one thing that we don't always see when we see Jesus on the cross crying out Psalm 22 is here is a guy who is having evil done to him. And he cries out, and what he cries out to God is a psalm. Specifically, a lament psalm. I don't know if you're familiar with that phrase, the lament psalms. So the lament psalms are these categories of psalms where people are experiencing pain, they cry out to God in pain, and they're asking for God to help them. Now, there's 150 psalms in the book of Psalms. And depending upon how you count and measure them, somewhere between a third and a half are lament psalms. Isn't that amazing? Between a third and a half of all the psalms are lament psalms, people crying out in pain. Jesus prays the laments when he comes to suffering. Most of the lament psalms follow the kind of this basic pattern. They usually begin with some kind of expression of, really, it's frustration with God because they're waiting on God to deliver them, and he's taking an awful long time. There's some kind of a statement of how they are suffering. So it kind of begins with this suffering, this waiting. And then there's a cry out to God for help. God, help me, come to my rescue. And then the Psalms end with this statement of trust, this statement of worship. So I've included in your notes Psalm 13. It's a real short psalm, but it's very representative of the lament psalms, and you see the three movements there. So look at Psalm 13, verse 1. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him. Lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. But I've trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. So you see kind of those three parts there in the Psalms. It begins with this, how long, O Lord? This, I'm waiting for deliverance. I'm suffering. In the middle, there's this cry out to God, deliver me, answer me. And at the end, there's this sudden statement of trust, of praise, of worship. But I trust you, I sing to you, I rejoice in your salvation. Walter Brueggemann, a theologian, I don't know if he was the first one to make this observation. He probably was the first one to use these words. He says the lament psalms, they move from orientation to disorientation to new orientation. Theologians use fancy words to say simple things. So basically, it makes them feel justified for what they're doing with their life, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, so what he's saying is orientation is there's the point in your life where you're oriented. Everything makes sense. What should be up is up. What should be down is down. The righteous prosper, the wicked suffer. God seems close. Prayers are answered quickly. Everything makes sense. And then something happens. And suddenly you're disoriented. What should be up is down. What should be down is up. The righteous are suffering. The wicked are prospering. You cry out to God, but the prayers aren't answered quickly. God doesn't seem close. And suddenly you lose this orientation. You're disoriented. And then the lament psalms end with a new orientation. And the new orientation is not that what was causing you fear has magically gone away, but the new orientation is in the light of this fear, you are able to express praise and trust and worship in God. Orientation, disorientation, new orientation. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about the book of Psalms, the lament psalms don't always make it very clear of how you get from disorientation to new orientation. I mean, did you notice that in Psalm 13? Didn't it seem a little odd to you? How long, O Lord, my life's miserable, but I will sing to you. Like, oh, how'd you get from, how do you get from here to here? One of the mysteries of the lament psalms is when you're in that disorientation, where God seems silent and he seems absent and evil is rising over you, how do you get to that place where you can sing and you can trust? One of the psalms that gives us a little bit clearer picture about how to get from point A to point B is Psalm 77. So I've put Psalm 77 in your notes, or you can read it in your copy of the Word of God. But Psalm 77 is a lament psalm of Asaph. And it begins with a very typical song of lament. So he says in verse 1, I cry aloud to God, he will hear me. In the day of my trouble I seek the Lord, and the night of my hand is stretched out without wearying, but my soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled, I cannot speak. I consider the days of old, the years long ago. And I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. Then my spirit made a diligent search. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? And those are some strong questions. Kind of read those and you're like, man, you can't say that in church. What are you talking about? Has God forgotten to be gracious? You're not supposed to say that. But he cries that out. Then in verse 10 is the turning point. He said, I will appeal to this. This is what I will do. I'm in the dark night. I'm in this disorientation, and so this is how I'm going to get out. Verse 11, I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work. I will meditate on your mighty deeds. For your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You're the God who works wonders. You have made known your might among the peoples. With your arm you redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and the children of Joseph. And what he does is he meditates and he thinks about the great works of God, and he goes back to the time period in the Old Testament with the children of Joseph and the children of Jacob are enslaved in Egypt under the Pharaoh. And they are suffering, and they are waiting, and they are crying out. And then God sends a guy by the name of Moses. Moses, go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. Pharaoh says no. And then Pharaoh makes it worse on the Hebrews. So here you have God's people. They're waiting, they're suffering. They hear words God's going to deliver, and then things get worse before it gets better. And then God acts decisively. And so the psalm continues in verse 16. And he's talking about the crossing of the Red Sea. So when he says, when the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters. Yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. In this lament psalm, we get a little bit of insight. Asaph is in that period where he's disoriented, where he is suffering evil, and God's not coming quickly to the rescue. And he says, the way I'm going to get out of this is I'm going to meditate on what happened in the Exodus story. So here was God's people. They were suffering and waiting. And then God acted decisively and delivered them. And so he says, I'm like God's people who are waiting for deliverance to come. It will come. I'm just waiting. And he meditates on that in the midst of his disorientation. So I read all of the lament psalms this week. And as I was reading the part 3 of the lament psalms, the where you get to the new orientation, where there's this trust and this praise, I began to notice there are several things that keep showing up. Several things that keep showing up in this statement of worship and trust and praise. And so trying to build a backward bridge, if this is present in the new orientation, then you have to cross that bridge to get from here to there, if that makes sense. So I was looking at what's present over here that we need to cross that bridge to get there. And just 3 things I want to call your attention to that were in part of this new orientation. And you see them in Psalm 13 in those last 2 verses, verses 5 and 6. And the first thing that's part of that new orientation is over and over again, they talk about the steadfast love of the Lord. Over and over, they talk about the steadfast love of the Lord. And one thing I want you to realize, when you read your English Old Testament, whenever you see this phrase, the steadfast love of the Lord, that is one Hebrew word. It's the Hebrew word hesed. It's the Old Covenant equivalent of grace. It is an incredible word for the Hebrews to say, our God has steadfast love for us. It is not fickle. It does not come and go. It does not have a timer on it. It does not give up. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. And so in Psalm 13 he says, I have trusted in your steadfast love. In the period of disorientation, there are 3 questions you have to answer. Question number 1, does God love me? Does He see me? Does He know what's going on in my life? Does He even care? Does He love me? Question number 2, does God have a plan? Is He wise enough to know what to do with this situation? And question number 3, does God have the power to do something about it? Those 3 questions you have to wrestle with in the middle of disorientation. Does God love me? Does He have a wisdom? And does He have the power to do something about it? So when you get to the other side, the psalmist says, I have trusted in the steadfast love of the Lord. In the disorientation phase, you have to get to that place where you can say, I trust in the steadfast love of the Lord. I will not give up that trust. The second thing that I noticed that's so often in the new orientation stage of these Psalms is singing. You see it here in Psalm 13, I will sing to the Lord. And it's not just in Psalm 13. Over and over in the lament Psalms, they get to the end and they talk about singing. Singing to the Lord, singing to the Lord. There's something about singing that gets us to the other side. So Dr. Jeremy Begbie's a theology professor at Duke Divinity School, and he tells the story of when he was visiting a church in South Africa. It was a town in South Africa, a small town, and really it experienced a lot of tragedy. A tornado had just recently come through the town, and it destroyed 50 homes. For a small village, that was a lot of people, a lot of homes. Had killed 5 members. But the Saturday night before the Sunday morning he was in church service, one of their own, a 14-year-old boy in their church, had been chased down by a gang and stabbed to death in the city. So he just shows up on the Sunday morning after these tragedies have happened. He says that the pastor began the service with this prayer: Lord, you are the creator and the sovereign. But why did the wind come like a snake and tear our roofs off? Why did a mob cut short the life of one of our own children when he had everything to live for? Over and over again, Lord, we are in the midst of death. And that's how he ended his prayer. Dr. Begbie said when the pastor sat down, there was just this hush over the congregation. You could hear some sniffles and some crying and some sighing, but just nothing. He says, and suddenly in the congregation, somewhere in the back, someone started singing. And it started off soft. And then others around them started singing with them. And it began to spread until the entire congregation was singing. And then the volume of the singing got louder and louder and louder. And then the congregation was standing. And he says they just kept singing song after song after song after song. And this is what he wrote about that experience. He said, Christian hope isn't about looking around at the state of things now and trying to imagine where it's going. It's not about trying to calculate the future from the present. Christian hope is about breathing now the fresh air of the ending. It's about tasting the spices and sipping the wine of the feast yet to come. That's a great sentence. I wish I had written it. I mean, hear that again. Christian hope is about breathing now the fresh air of the ending, tasting the spices and sipping the wine of the feast yet to come. That's what happens when we sing. We breathe the air of the ending. We are tasting the feast that is going to come when Christ returns. It is breathing that air now, and with that breath we sing. This is why singing is such a spiritual battle. Now, I know none of you have these thoughts that go through your head as you sing, right? Why are we singing that song and not this song? Why are we standing so long? Why can't we sit? Why is that instrument on? Is that beat on? Right? The reason you're struggling with that is because Satan wants your mind on anything other than the fresh air that you are invited to breathe as you sing. He does not want you to get lost in tasting the spices or sipping the wine of the feast that is yet to come as you sing, because he knows there is something powerful when you sing of the feast that is yet to come that delivers you from the fear of evil. That's why singing is such a spiritual battle, because Satan knows there's power. There's power. Third thing I noticed that shows up in the new orientation of these lament psalms is this statement, this conviction that there will be joy and there will be justice on the other side. I mean, notice in Psalm 13 he says, "My heart shall rejoice in your salvation." He's not experiencing the salvation of God right now, but he is so convinced that the salvation of the Lord will come. Justice will come. Joy will come. I'm so convinced of it that I can go ahead and rejoice now in the deliverance that's going to come later. And so he says it past tense, my heart shall rejoice in your salvation. That's why in the story of the Count of Monte Cristo, that's why they carved into the wall, "God will give me justice." That's our heart cry to say there needs to be justice. There needs to be a time when God comes in and makes that which is wrong and makes it right. And these psalms always end up with this conviction, I will see the deliverance of the Lord. And to sing as if that has already happened. So let me ask you, do the lament psalms give us a magic phrase that makes all of our troubles go away? No. If you sing the songs of lament, will it protect you from evil? No. But it gives words to the heart cry of your soul. It gives you permission to pray things that you thought you're not supposed to pray. God, have you forgotten how to be gracious? It gives you permission to pray that. And it reminds you what's going on in this moment is a faith struggle. Can you trust that God loves you or not? It reminds you to sing, to worship. Don't abandon worship in the darkness. You need worship all the more in the darkness. And it reminds you joy and justice will come. So let me ask you today, what stage are you in? Orientation, disorientation, new orientation? I would bet for most of us in the room, we are still in the orientation stage. Life's oriented, everything's as it should. What's up is up, what should be down is down. God's close, God's near, the righteous prosper, the wicked suffer. It all makes sense. Can I tell you, believers, disorientation is coming. Disorientation is coming. Is your faith ready for that period? You will walk through the dark night of the soul. You will pray Psalm 13 from the depth of your heart someday. Are you building the kind of faith that's going to be ready to endure? Maybe you are in the disorientation stage. God seems so far away. You are crying for help and God just never seems to come. My prayer is that, number one, you realize you're not the first follower of God who's ever prayed that prayer. You're not the first person to ever think those thoughts. That is very common with the experience of God's people. And I hope that through the lament psalms, you hear God calling to you, reminding you of His steadfast love, inviting you to breathe the air of the future as you sing, and encouraging you, reminding you, deliverance will come. Let me give you 2 more Psalms to read on your own this week. If you're in the orientation stage and everything is right in your life, you're thinking, I don't want to read any more of these depressing Psalms. Let's do something different. If you're in the disorientation phase, you love these Psalms because they are the prayer of your heart. There's a bunch of them, but read Psalm 56 and Psalm 59. Psalm 56 and Psalm 59. These great psalms that lead us to deliverance and victory. Okay? Do not fear the bad guys, because joy and justice will come. Let's pray together.